morning, everybody. My name is Stephanie Anderson. I'm the Assistant Director of Selection at BookOps, which doesn't mean much unless you know that the BookOps is the shared technical services unit of the New York Public Library and the Brooklyn Public Library. And what that means is that I manage the team of amazing librarians who select and order the circulating collections for the 150 branches of the New York and Brooklyn Public Libraries, in addition to their 2 individual digital collections. Collection development and readers advisory are my professional passion. I love them very much. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk about collection development with you guys. So let's go ahead and get started. And please, yeah, if you are comfortable introducing yourself in the chat, please do. I'd love to know who we've got here today. So as a reminder of what we're going to be covering today, we're talking about community-centered collection development. So what a community needs from its library changes, as you no doubt know, changes all the time. And it can be tricky to understand when those changes are happening, what those changes are, and especially if any of you are working with limited resources. So budget cuts, staff shortages, any extra challenges that we're all facing right now. So in this session, we're going to talk first about some really basic collection development principles so we can start our conversation by regrounding in those. And then I'm going to introduce a couple really simple tools and concepts that I think you can use to make sure you're centering your collection development practices around your community. And then we'll have some practical other ways that you can work that in as well. So these are our goals for this session. Please note that I am going to be using public library examples throughout because that's my background. I've never worked in another kind of library, but I do believe the skills and tools we're going to talk about here today can be applied to any kind of library, school, academic, special. And I also want to note, I obviously do come from 2 really big libraries, and you might be thinking, oh, if NYPL does it, I don't know if that would work for me, but I actually started my career in a small library, the Darien Library in Connecticut. And I know these tools can work for like a single town library or the school library in an elementary school, all the way up to a really big academic library across multiple buildings. So that's the goal of what we're doing here today. But please, at any point, feel free to put questions in the chat if anything's not clear. And as Becca said, I am going to pause and see what you think. And usually librarians have a lot to say, so I'm really looking forward to what you would like to add. All right, so we're going to start by reviewing 2 slides of collection development basics, just to ground us and make sure we're all starting with the same knowledge base. I know that not everybody goes to library school before they work in a library, and not everybody even takes collection development in library school. So I think it's important to lay these as a baseline. If you already know them, I would invite you to consider, while I'm talking, whether everyone you work with knows them, because I think if you work with collections for a living, these are things you take for granted. It's the air you breathe, it's the water you swim in. But if you don't, or you've not been exposed to them, these might be really new ideas for a lot of people. Okay, so the first principles of collection development. To my mind, there are 2 first principles. The first is that knowledge and creativity and imagination and art and just the human capacity to create are infinite. They're infinite in all directions. They go back to the very beginning of human history, and they will go forward until humans are no more. And in between, there's just an infinite number of things that people make. At the same time, as you all probably know all too well, library resources and space and time are sadly quite finite. Much more finite than any of us would like them to be, I think. And when I say resources, I want to be clear, I'm not just talking about your book budget, your materials budget. I'm also talking about your staff time, which in many libraries in this country is even more of a scarce resource than the materials budget. So these are our 2 first principles. These are true all the time. They're true when I'm not at work, they're true when I am at work, they're true in your libraries. Both of these things are always happening at the same time. And there's a real tension between those things, right? Like there's the infinite number of things that could go in a collection and the finite nature of the collection itself. So every decision we make about collections, when we do collection development, both of these things are true at the same time. And when we do collection development, we're attempting to resolve that inherent tension. I think these pair really well with another important and pivotal piece of collection development basics, which are Ranganathan's 5 laws of library science. And if you've not been exposed to them or it's been a while, as a reminder, these are real simple. But number 1, books are for use. Number 2, every reader his or her or their book. Number 3, every book its reader. Number 4, save the time of the reader. Number 5, the library is a growing organism. These laws were written in 1931. They're nearly 100 years old, And I don't believe they have ever been more true than they are today. They stand the test of time for a reason. That's because they're really pivotal in understanding what is a library collection and how do we work with a library collection. And when we have to make tough decisions, because the first principles tell us that we're going to have to make a lot of tough decisions, how do we do it? So these are two really important concepts that I think you want to keep in mind no matter what kind of collection you're working with or what kind of collections work you're doing. So how does knowing these things help us practice community-centered collection development, if that's our end goal? Well, since we know we've just decided or agreed upon, since no one's disagreeing with me in the chat, it appears that we agree that knowledge is infinite and libraries are not infinite. So community input becomes a really crucial, and I would argue the most crucial way that we gather information that allows us to make good decisions. There are just simply more things available than we could ever make available. And also our communities, whoever you're serving, whether it's directly or indirectly, are also often the people who are paying for everything in the collection, not to mention for many of our own salaries. Now, does this mean that because, and sorry to trigger you if you are thinking of the patron who says, I pay your salary. That's not what I mean. But what I mean is building a library collection is an extraordinary responsibility because whether you're spending people's tax dollars or their tuition dollars, you are essentially taking people's money and making good decisions for them on their behalf. And that means that their input is really crucial and what they're looking for is really crucial. And now, does this mean that because somebody asks for something, we buy it every time? No. And does this mean that people get to tell us how we run our collections? Absolutely not. We're professionals. Our job is to use their input to make consistent professional collections decisions. But it's also our job to make sure that we're using the right data and the right observations and the right inputs to make the best possible decisions on behalf of the communities we serve. Even though these principles are pretty timeless, how we implement them, what they look like in the real world is constantly in a state of flux, especially in the last 5 years. And this can be super, super hard to manage in a library setting. Like I said, if budgets are tight, staffing is reduced, or if you don't know what your community needs, which again, in the last 5 years, with a lot of the changes many libraries have experienced, it has become a lot harder to determine that for many people. So we want to avoid the lane of we've always done it this way. And we also want to avoid only making changes when someone makes a big complaint or is really pushy. So intentionally collecting and considering community input allows us to navigate all of this. We get feedback from our patrons collections in a lot of forms, and most of these are probably pretty familiar to you, right? So in order to make sure we're centering our community when we make decisions, and when I say make decisions, I'm talking about the micro to the macro. So here's a new book, should I buy it? That's a decision. There's also, how many shelves of the nonfiction section should we devote to biographies? Is this the right number of biographies? Is this laid out right? And even a huge decision, if we have directors on the call, like how big should the book budget be? How do I balance that with all the other needs that I have in my budget? Micro to macro, in order to ensure that the community is centered in those decisions, we need to seek and assess this input. And thankfully, it comes in a lot of forms. Many of these are things you probably thought about before, like what's being borrowed? What's being renewed after it's borrowed? What gets used in the library and doesn't get taken home? What gets put on hold? What people want so much they put it on hold? What do patrons say to us? What do they say in emails? What do they say over the phone? What do they say over the desk? What do they say at your staff chat forum? All the different ways that patrons let us know what they think. And then there's a lot of more like sort of sideline secondary input, like what are the schools assigning? What's on the summer reading list? What are local, not your book groups in the library, but other book groups that people make on their own in the community? What are they reading? Which programs are most popular? Which organizations do you have really good partnerships with when you do outreach? All of these things are really important forms of input as well. So circulation data is the most common form of input that I think most libraries use when they are making assessments. Again, those micro to macro assessments. So most libraries are in some way looking at what's circulating, what's checked out. And I think these can be a crucial difference. There's a difference between checkouts, that's at initial borrow, circulations, which also includes renewals. Those are two different activities. And also holds data. These are things that we pay a lot of attention to. And this data does tell us a lot. I'm a selector. In addition to managing a selection department, I'm also a selector. And this is data I'm looking at constantly when I'm doing selection. It's also data that we use at the back end of a book's life. It's something we use to consider when we do weeding or deaccessioning or any other way that we work with the materials that we have. This is data we look at. It tells us a lot, but it's not the whole story. And from a public library standpoint, I want to give you 3 examples that you've probably experienced before that show us why circ data is only part of the story. The first is children's nonfiction. Children's nonfiction, for the children's specialists in the audience, is a slightly more unusual, doesn't behave the way that fiction does, right? Because for starters, a lot of it just gets used in the branch. It's used for one homework help question. It's used, like the kid just needs to photocopy one page that they can use in a report. It also has much bigger cycles. There's certain sections that only go out once a year or only tied to a certain thing happening in the community. As opposed to, say, Dogman, which we can expect to go out pretty continuously until pages start falling out of it. Books released by celebrities, of which there are more than ever somehow, are also very unusual. They tend to show a ton of demand and very high circ. They don't tend to have a very long tail, particularly if word gets out that the audiobook edition is better. So they might be really big. You might see a lot of holds. They might show a ton of circ, but it's usually not extended. And we also can't necessarily use it to predict how other celebrity books will do. So like just because the Prince Harry book circulated really well doesn't mean that the next book written by a royal circs very well. And then finally, there are types of books that are used consistently, but not continuously. So for example, 3 that are really common in public libraries are books about holidays, test prep, and travel guides. Not only are test prep and travel guides released on a really specific publishing schedule that we don't have a lot of control over, but also these are things that come in seasons, right? Like people travel more in the summer. Tests happen when they happen. Holidays happen mostly once a year. So you're not going to see your Easter books in most cases going out year round. If you have civil service exams in your library, you're only going to see them really heavily used at the time the exam is scheduled. But it's consistent, and these are things that people use. So just looking at circ and comparing straight circulation data isn't going to give us the full story about what people are asking for from us. The last thing I'll note here is that people can't borrow what we haven't put on the shelf. So we're missing that really important piece of data when we only look at what circs and what gets put on hold. And then long-standing practices, which I'm hoping we can examine today, about how we've shelved and displayed and made books available can also skew this data a lot. And we'll talk about that more as we go through. Okay, so if I'm telling you circulation doesn't do everything you want it to do, what am I suggesting that you think about instead? We're going to add something called turnover to your toolbox today. It can give you a new lens on the work that you're already doing. I think it's a pretty easy thing to add to whatever assessments you're already doing. And beyond what I show you today, it doesn't really require that you subscribe to anything special or do a ton of intensive training. And that's why I love it so much. It's a really simple analysis. I think anyone can do this, and it allows us to look for bigger patterns in what our communities want. Turnover is very simple math. It is simply the total circulation of something over a 12-month period divided by the total number of items of that same thing that were available in that 12-month period. And I will give you a couple examples on the next slide so we can walk through this. And so why do I love turnover so much more than circ? It's because I think it is the capacity to give us really big insights into what our communities are trying to tell us when they use the library. It also allows for much more consistency over time, no matter what's happening outside the library. So whether your budget is cut or increased, whether your staffing is challenged, whether your hours change, all the different things that can happen externally outside the library that we can't control. As you guys may know, budget plays a really big role in how circulation fluctuates, but turnover can be a lot more consistent because it's not just impacted by buying books. It's also impacted by weeding, inventorying, merchandising, and paying attention to what people want to see. So it allows us to develop not just stronger buying skills as an institution, but also much stronger collection maintenance skills and even reader's advisory. When you aim for turnover and you think about turnover, you're not just chasing circulation, as some people call it. You're also thinking about the long-term health and sustainability of the collection, and what your communities are expecting from you. So, book math. I'm sorry, I didn't go to library school to do a lot of math, and I know none of you did either. Maybe you did. I sure didn't, but the good news is book math is a lot less fidgety than the rest of math. So I actually really love book math. So we're going to work through a little math today. As I said, it gets measured. This is a pretty basic calculation, but we can apply this calculation across a lot of different things. So we're going to use an imaginary library for the next few slides to show how you could perform this calculation. So Again, moving from macro to micro, let's think about how we could use this to assess how a library's collection is performing. Let's pretend in 2024, so we have a complete year of data for a library, 2024, our imaginary library had 10,000 items on its shelves and had 45,000 circulations from those items. So how would we calculate the turnover of this library? We would take the total circs, we would divide it by the total items, and we would find 4.5 is the turnover of the library. Now, before anybody asks, is that a good turnover? Maybe, I don't know. We'll talk about that later. What a good turnover is depends a lot on what you're measuring and what you're measuring it for and how your library functions. But as a baseline, we know that this library has a full turnover of 4.5. Another way we could express this would be to say that on average in this library in 2024, everything in the collection was borrowed 4.5 times. That's a great baseline to start with. Now, does that mean any books actually went out 4.5 times? Definitely not, because it's just like 2.5 children being average family size. You can't borrow a book 4.5 times. But it does mean you probably had some bestsellers that went out like 12, 15, 20 times. You had some books that didn't go out at all. You had a bunch of books that went out 1 or 2 times or 5 times. And on average, they went out 4.5 times. So that's what we're baselining for our imaginary library. Okay, so now we can use that same calculation, that turnover calculation, to dig even deeper into how the community is using the library. When we look at turnover across lots of different parts of a library, we're going to find a lot of different turnovers. And if you work with collections already, that makes sense because different parts of a collection are inherently used differently. Adult fiction and adult nonfiction have different patterns. We may have circ policy that impacts how long a book can go out or whether it can be renewed. So when we see these different numbers, it's important not to assign any kind of value judgment to them. We're just observing them in relation to themselves. So in our imaginary library, let's go back to our imaginary library. Let's pretend that of their collection, 5,000 of the books are adult books and 20,000 circs came from those adult books. So what we would calculate is that the adult collection in this library has an average turnover of 4. At the same time, maybe this library also got 20,000 circs from its children's books, but the children's collection is only 4,000 items. So that means the turnover in the children's section is 5. They have the same circulation, but a different turnover. In other words, the collections have the same circ, but the children's books on average are being borrowed 1 more time a year than the adult books. We're just going to do one more slide of math. So you can really take this quite far. You can get super micro with this depending on what you do in your library. We could just look at adult fiction and let's pretend that 2,500 of the books are adult fiction, but 12,000 circulations came from them. That means that the adult fiction has a much higher turnover than the collection overall. It's 4.8. You might even be noticing that's higher than the library collection baseline too, 4.8. And the way that small public libraries work, that probably makes sense, right? Adult fiction is a real driver of circulation in a lot of libraries. We could even drill down to a specific author. We'll use one of my faves, Louise Penny, and we might find, whoa, we had 30 Louise Penny books because we have a couple copies of a lot of her series, but they got 240 circulations in total in 2024. They had an average turnover of 8. What I would guess of our imaginary library is like maybe the earlier books in the Gamache series went out a couple of times, but she had a new one, and that went out like you had a bunch of copies of it, and they all went out 20, 25 times. But on average, Louise Penny does really well with this imaginary community. So on average, every adult fiction book went out an average of 4.8 times in this library, and every book by Louise Penny went out an average of 8 times in that year. Okay, so what are these patrons telling us right now? Do you guys think the library should just buy a bunch of Louise Penny and call it a day on everything else? Probably not. As much as I love Louise Penny, she's not for everybody. And also, she's not written enough books that we can just buy nothing but Louise Penny for the rest of our lives. So the next question we need to ask ourselves is, what do we do with this data? So we pretty much know what we want to do with circ data, but how do we incorporate the turnover data as well to make some decisions and understand what the community wants better, beyond just they really like Louise Penny? So I'm going to use the children's collection to show you how you could do a big picture look at a piece of your collection for this. And I'm using children's because children's collections tend to have a lot more moving pieces. And I've also noticed in working with libraries, what I've set this up to demonstrate what I found to be a pretty common phenomenon in children's collections, no matter how big the library is, how big the children's collection is. And a lot of this just has to do with how children's publishing and children as readers have evolved over the last 10 to 20 years. So let's go back to the children's collection, which we already know had 20,000 circs in a year in 2024 and had 4,000 items. And I've split it out here into some really common sections: board books, picture books, read-alongs, leveled readers, early chapter books, fiction, nonfiction, graphic novels. You may arrange your children's collection differently if you have a children's collection, but I think we can agree that's a pretty basic accounting of all the different things that are in a children's collection. Before we dig into the numbers, does anybody have any observations does anything really stand out to you about this children's collection? A lot of graphic novels, Amy, that's right. Yep. Read-alongs seem underserved. Yep. Great. You can keep putting observations to the chat, but some things jump out at us right away, right? Okay, so I'm going to do a really basic assessment and show you how I might walk through some numbers like this. So first, let's just look at pure circ, which is how many libraries are looking at data like this. When we look at pure circ, we see top 3 sections by circ are fiction, picture books, and nonfiction. Children's specialists in the chat, is this normal? It is, yes. These are generally some of the most popular books for children. They're also published much more widely than a lot of parts of children's publishing. And they meet a very wide range of needs, like fiction meets a bunch of different kids' needs. Nonfiction often meets the range of an even broader age range. And I want to note, very importantly, are some of the most long-standing formats for children's books. No matter how old your library is, if it has children's books in it, it has probably been buying these types of children's books, chapter books, nonfiction books, and picture books since it was founded. These are the sort of foundation of a children's collection. Okay, but then let's take a look at turnover. So looking at turnover that we've calculated here for all of these sections, we see something really different. Our 3 highest turn sections are read-alongs, as the chat noted, and leveled readers and graphic novels. I know we have some children's specialists here, so I'd love to hear, why do you guys think the highest turnover sections are so different than the highest circ sections? If you don't know anything about children's books, you can feel free to guess too, but I think our children's specialists will probably have a unique insight into this. So as people puzzle over this, one thing I'll mention, because it's been mentioned a bit in the chat already, is these are pretty popular formats, right? So if you work with children, you know they can't get enough graphic novels. Read-alongs have become really popular since they're introduced. If you're not familiar with the format, these are print books that have a digital audio player adhered to the inside of them, kind of like the newfangled version of the old book and CD sets, so you can listen to a book as you're reading it. And then leveled readers have seen an immense amount of growth in the last 10 to 15 years, particularly now with the reintroduction of the science of reading and phonics education. We're seeing a lot more schools and educators really looking to leveled readers to help kids as they move on their literacy journey. Any other thoughts people have? Someone's asking in the chat, are there fewer titles available for read-alongs? That's a really good point. Read-alongs are a super, super new format. I would say they're not even a decade old. So yeah, we don't have like hundreds of thousands of read-alongs to choose from the way we do, say, picture books. And someone else is mentioning a great point, which is that read-alongs are expensive. They are often 3 to 4 times more expensive than the non-read-along version of the same title. Some other things to note, these are newer formats for most libraries. So like I said, read-alongs, not only are they expensive and there's not as many of them, but most libraries have to make space for them. So you need to make space for them, and many people don't. It's not like most libraries have tons of space going spare where they can shove something into. So making space for new things means reducing space for other things. And some libraries can't change the size of their shelves, or maybe it's not so easy to do all those different things. Someone else has mentioned in the chat, graphic novels are quick reads, so you can read more of them in less time. That's another really good point. Same thing with leveled readers. They're maybe borrowed in stacks in a different way than fiction books, which just take longer to borrow. So there's a lot of different reasons this might be true. I want to compare 2 in particular, because as I said, I think this is a phenomenon I've seen in a lot of different libraries, which is, let's directly compare nonfiction and graphic novels for a minute. So even though nonfiction technically outsorts graphic novels in this library, we can see that on average, each graphic novel went out twice as many times as each nonfiction book. And if you want to make that even more clear, you can look at the two columns, the fourth and the fifth column. You can compare the percentage of items to the percentage of circulation to see that the graphic novels are, as I would put it, working hard. They're working real hard in this library. And one thing we might think about is whether adding more of them would drive more circulation. Because what our community seems to be telling us here is they're going to borrow these graphic novels. They're borrowing them way more than they're actually available to borrow. That's how much they're drawn to them. And they give us a good comparison too, because they represent this sea change in publishing that I was talking about. So nonfiction has been around forever. It's been published for a long time. If you buy it, you know, there's a tons of types of nonfiction. There's the educational publishers. There's the Who Was series. There's all these different kinds. And at the same time, graphic novels are still building up. In fact, it's been kind of tricky for a lot of libraries to totally meet the need for graphic novels because a lot of people have bought a ton of them and kids run through them and they're like, we need more. We need more manga that's appropriate for younger kids and things that people are asking publishers for. There's also been a real change in reader preference. There are still lots of kids who love to read nonfiction, but graphic novels have changed how a lot of kids choose what they want to read. There's also a much better understanding among educators and caregivers. Hopefully, we're walking away from the comics aren't reading, but understanding they're actually a really involved and special kind of literacy to be able to, not only do they help kids develop their print literacy, but they also help kids begin to do multiple literacy skills at the same time. So there's just been a change in how books are published for children, how we think about what children need to read, and most importantly, what the children are choosing to read. Someone's asked in the chat, what does the percentage of items represent? Oh, that's a great question. Yes, that the number of graphic novel items is, yes, how many of the total collection, so we've got 4,000 total children's items and 500 of them are graphic novels. So that's the percentage by audience of the entire collection. And then, so it's 12.5% of items, but then there's 16.5% of circulation. And so that's one way that we can see like, wow, even though they're only 12.5% of what people could have borrowed, what my community chose to borrow, given everything that's here, they chose to borrow those things way more frequently. Okay, so what do we do with this information? If I'm the children's librarian, and Tess has made a great point in the chat, which is you'd be curious to see what the turnover of graphic nonfiction would be. That is such a good question, and it's one of the reasons I love turnover, because when you have a question like that, all you got to do is just do the simple division and take a look. So you can really use this in any sort of way to think about and compare and consider what our community is asking for. So you could look at this if you wanted and take it no further and be like, whoa, we have way too much nonfiction. Let's throw out half of it and make room for more graphic novels. Could do that. I don't know if I'd recommend it because even though the data tells us something really interesting, we also know that and the community is telling the library something here. Let's be clear. This isn't just like me playing with numbers like you. I did not go to library school to be a mathematician. I'm not doing this because I like to do division. I'm doing this because I want to know what the community is telling me. And by using turnover and circ, we're hearing our community a lot louder. But I don't care how deep, how many questions you ask, and I love to go down the rabbit hole, but quantitative data analysis is always going to be missing some pieces of the puzzle. And if you work with the public, you know this to be true. Quantitative data tells us a lot because we can learn from a lot of patrons who we never talk to at the desk or who never call us or never fill out a survey by just seeing how they use the library. But there's a lot of other things that we need to think about when we assess a collection. So here's some more qualitative questions I would want to ask as part of this analysis. In a children's library in particular, do we see that like a lot of nonfiction is used in the library, but it's just not taken out? This is, particularly for children's nonfiction, a pretty common phenomenon. So we'd want to understand that before we throw away half the nonfiction. Are there parts of nonfiction or any part of the children's library that is mainly being used for school outreach? So like we know the third graders always have to do an ecosystem project in October every year. And so the 500s are like kind of big in that section. They don't go out more than once a year, but they're really important to our relationship with local schools. How has use of this collection changed since 2020? I'll say for New York Public Library, for example, a lot of our print nonfiction collection development used to be around knowing many teachers had assignments that required a certain amount of print resources. Like you have to write a paper and you need 3 resources, and one of them has to be print. We saw a lot of teachers abandon that during the COVID lockdowns, and many of them never went back to requiring that. And that has made some substantial changes in how certain parts of the collection are used. In your community, it might look different, or if you're not working with children's books, it might look really different, but still thinking about like what are behavioral changes that might help us understand this. When was the collection last weeded? Maybe you're a great reader and you've been weeding constantly and you feel confident that everything there is up to date and in great shape. Or maybe you've just come to a new library and you don't know the last time it was weeded and you're having a look at the shelf and you're like, that's a kind of an old book about a country. So thinking about that is important too. How does CERC policy impact how patrons borrow children's books? How long are people allowed to borrow things? How are they allowed to renew them? Do educators have different borrowing policy than kids? Do kids have limitations on their cards that adults don't? All these different things that are unique to your library. How do your policy decisions, your hours, your service decisions, how do those impact use of different parts of the collection? And I think most importantly, what do kids ask for? What are people asking for at the desk? What are parents asking for at the desk? What are educators asking for at the desk? As I said at the beginning, people can't borrow what's not there. So if we won't throw you under the bus, we'll throw your predecessor under the bus. If you're constantly hearing about dinosaurs, but whoever was buying your children's books before, like just wasn't that into dinosaurs, that might be part of the problem, right? You might be like, well, of course the nonfiction circuit isn't as high. We don't have enough books on the topics that kids keep asking me about when they come to the desk. So all of these are different things, questions that this analysis brings up for me. And if you guys have other questions that you would ask about patron behavior, qualitative behavior, I'd love to hear them. Like what kind of questions do we ask to make sure we're doing a full community analysis, not just looking at the numbers? While we're waiting for that, someone made a great comment in the chat, like how much should we weight in-house use as a general principle? It's hard to make a case on its utility in determining ordering. That's a great point. And again, a lot of what we're doing with this process is trying to make a tough decision, right? Because none of us suddenly has an extra however much money to buy a bunch of new books just to try something. I don't think most of us have like a secret room that's full of shelves that we've just kept closed. So when we decide to increase or decrease a part of the budget or our shelving or item count, we're weighing these really heavy things. For in-house use is a great example. So like how much should I determine how in-house use plays into this? What I'd say is it's hard, without being a cop-out, it's a little hard to determine because I can't see your patrons. But that's why it's important to do these things in community with the people you work with. Like, do we see in-house use as important, but maybe only for some parts of the collection? What type of in-house use are people doing? Is it certain times of year? Is it for certain tasks or assignments? So in general principle, you might say like, okay, well, the 500s are really big and maybe they're underperforming, but we just see them used constantly. Like they're used all the time. And I just don't feel comfortable weeding them too heavily as a result. But at the same time, you might say like, but the 800s, not only are they not turning and circing so great, I don't even really see kids looking at them in the branch. So maybe I don't need to think about in-house use so much for that one. So I think it'll look really different for just given the shape of your library and who you're serving. Okay, so I will say overall, if I were this children's librarian, my takeaway would be I need to make some changes to my collection. Patrons are telling me something here, and depending on how I answer those questions from the last slide, I might make different determinations about what they're telling me, but I'm really curious. My thought is that we probably need to think about like, how are our shelves laid out? How is my budget arranged? I need to make some changes, and I'm curious what you guys think. Like, if you were going to change one thing, if you were the children's librarian at this library and you wanted to test something to see if you're right about what this data and your analysis is telling you, what would you consider? If you were this children's librarian, what would you go to your director and ask to do? First answer in the chat is buy more graphic novels and less nonfiction. I agree. I'd probably do the same thing. I don't know how crazy I'd go, particularly because you'd want to look through what types of graphic novels, what types of nonfiction, but I probably would make some budget changes. I would probably also need to look at my shelving. In my experience, most libraries, particularly if you've been in the building a long time or it's an older building, have had to like wedge graphic novels into whatever shelving is available, whereas the nonfiction books are just still sitting on the big, beautiful shelves they've been sitting on since Carnegie gave gave the library a gift. So you probably, a lot of times these limitations aren't just budget, they're about shelf layout. By another comment in the chat, think about what's in different formats and how they're being promoted. That's a really great point. Like, does the library offer a way to read graphic novels digitally? Thank you for saying that. Yes, none of these assessments happen in a vacuum. Like, how does it all fit together is a great question. Try some graphic nonfiction. That's another really good point. Like, I know some libraries, a lot of libraries handle something like these cross-genre, cross-format things like graphic nonfiction differently. Like, maybe that needs to be pulled out and put somewhere else, and like put somewhere more obvious. Maybe you need to be doing more displays. There's a lot of different things you might take away. One thing I've found doing this assessment with real branches is you might find that like leveled reader nonfiction does really well for you, which some libraries shelve with their nonfiction rather than their leveled readers. You might be able to bring up your nonfiction circ and turn just by making those easier to find and browse. Look at what types of nonfiction are being used. Is it assigned reading? Are kids reading it for fun, for courses? A great question. That works for all ages of nonfiction. Nonfiction collections tend to have like a weird combination of like things that are true and fun to read and things that are true and maybe fun to read, but their main idea is being fact-based. So you want to kind of pry those things apart. When we go back to first principles, we can see how turnover really helps us to consider our community's preferences just in greater detail. And because it's simple to calculate, anyone in your library should be able to do it when needed. If you have your circ number and you know how many items you have, turnover is really easy. You can just, and you don't even have to do the math yourself. You can put a formula in Excel or Google Sheets and let the computer do the division for you. So you can consider them together. It doesn't have to be an either or. And they really help us to spot these shifts where if we're just looking at circ for this library, we might be like, well, fiction and nonfiction and picture books are still circing the best. I guess that's where the bulk of the budget has to go. Turnover has us drill down and be like, oh, well, that's interesting. Maybe we do need to make some shifts. We didn't even introduce the idea of languages here, but if you are serving multiple languages in your library, this is another place where you might be like, English books tend to out-circ world language books in most libraries. But when you look at turnover, you might see a really different story. But there is no quantitative data that can be understood without qualitative data. So we also want to know, what do we know from the patrons themselves? They're telling us one thing in the numbers and they're telling us one thing with their behavior and their questions. How do we bring this together and make a good professional decision? Going back to the idea of the library being a growing organism, I love that idea because I often think of libraries in garden metaphors. And I like to think that if you're a gardener, if a librarian is like a gardener, keep in mind that gardeners are not just responsible for planting plants and keeping them alive. In order to do that well, they need to understand where they're planting the plants. What are the conditions under which we're growing this organism or growing a garden? And what that means is understanding like what people want. If you're gardening plants, it means understanding like what band you're in and how often it rains and how much light different parts of your windowsills get. And if you're a librarian, it means understanding like what circs, what are people asking for? And when people have the entirety of our organism available to them, what do they choose? Understanding the conditions of your growing organism, I think, is at the heart of community-centered collection development. There's a lot of other ways we gather feedback too, and I just wanted to mention them briefly. You may be doing some of them already, but I wanted to mention them in case you're not. For outreach, I think a really underlooked tool is being able to talk about purchase suggestions when you do outreach. Most people who aren't already regular library users, who are by definition the people we're trying to target with outreach most of the time, have no idea that the library takes purchase suggestions. This goes double if you're doing outreach to immigrant communities, folks for whom English is not their first language, people who have never had a library card before for whatever reason. They're definitely not going to assume they can tell you what to buy. So using that as part of your outreach strategy, whether it's like a tabling event or a direct meeting with a community org that you're trying to have a relationship with, offering that and putting that out there is, one, a great tool to get people to be library users, but also a great tool to get non-user feedback into your collection. So not just people who are using the library already, but these people who you're trying to pull in, making sure you're going to have the stuff they want once they get there. Making sure your programs have this collections connection, that whatever you're doing, you're bringing something in. This can be as obvious as, I'm doing a knitting program and I brought the knitting books up. Another one I see libraries doing that I love is having a cart full of easy paperback reads that can be wheeled over to wherever story time is happening. Because most parents coming for story time, caregivers coming for story time, they're not going to go take their little baby into the fiction section and try to find something to read. Speaking as someone who used to have a little baby, that's very stressful. But they might grab something that looks fun and is right there on their way out the door to the circ desk. There's a lot of different ways you can make sure collections are involved with all the other things you're doing. Displays that are community oriented are also a great way to keep developing that relationship within the people you serve. So two of my favorites are something like finally available, which is great for those high holds titles where maybe you bought a bunch of copies of the book, but a lot of patrons can't or won't place holds. It doesn't work for them for some reason. They don't want to use it, but they maybe still want to read the book everybody has been talking about. So once it's finally available, it's still new to a lot of people. That can be a super popular display. Also, what your neighbors are reading. If any of you have ever seen your patrons like go over and sneakily look at your shelving cart, you process all the returns and you put them on the cart to shelve, and you can't go shelve them because the patrons are looking at it. That's because they want to know what other people are reading. Most people are really uncomfortable picking out their own reading, or they feel like they don't know enough. And a good shortcut is to be like, well, someone around here thought this was good enough to borrow. Let me take a look at these ones. So those are other ways you can get the community not just engaging with you, but with each other. And then finally, there's surveys. I'm sure a lot of you do surveys. Those can be tricky, especially if you're in a smaller library or if you're in a big library that likes to do all of its own surveys and you can't really do them on your own. So to that end, as simple as a tool that's as old as time is just like making a note of what people say at the desk. You may do this, you may not. If you don't have to do it all the time. You can do it during certain times. You can ask just to collect feedback on certain types of collections questions, whatever it is. There can be in many libraries a gap between the folks who are working on collections and the folks who are doing these other things. So is this all about just trying to close that gap internally so that you can marry all of this community feedback and activity together? All right, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm just going to go over a couple takeaways and then we'll move to questions. So a few takeaways. We'll review how you could, if you want to take some of this back to your library. And I'd invite you to think about one or two things that would personally work for you that you'd like to try in the next month. And so here's a few of the things that are takeaways for me. One is bring turnover into your life if you haven't already. Whatever your standard reporting is, do you do it once a year? Do you do it quarterly? Is it something you need to provide to funders? Is it something you need to provide to electeds? Bring turnover in. Generally, if you're doing some kind of reporting or data analysis, you already have the two pieces of data you need to calculate turnover. So this is as simple in many cases as adding another column to a spreadsheet with a formula and calling it a day. It is built into some tools like Collection HQ, and that's great if you have it, but you don't need a fancy tool for this. This is something you can easily do on your own with data that should be pretty available to you already. And then just get in the habit of looking at circ and turnover as a pair. I'm not telling you to throw circ away. It has its own things to tell us. And even if it didn't, usually the person who pays for the library wants to hear about it. So you got to keep it, but get in the habit of using them together. If you're comfortable with it, even using it with other people, talking to your city council, your first selectman, whoever it is, making sure they're understanding the many ways we think about data. I will note, as we talked about, you may see some changes when you do this the first time. You don't need to change everything right away, right? Because we want to be responsive to the community. When we make a change, sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. Just pick one thing. Like in our imaginary library, I think the chat was right on to say, yeah, there's something going on here with graphic novels. We need to find a way to do something with that. Like, don't do everything. We don't need to fix everything. Let's not worry about leveled readers for now, or read-alongs. Maybe they're expensive and we can't buy too many of them. We're just going to drill down for 6 months on making some changes to graphic novels and see what happens. See what the community tells us, both with their feedback and their choices. When the numbers aren't clear or you're conflicted, which happens a lot, these are not necessarily easy decisions. They're often really hard decisions, and there's not always a great answer. That's where that additional community input. What do people say at the desk? What are schools assigning? What kind of feedback are you getting elsewhere? That's where that community input becomes really, really important. I think it's when librarians make tough choices, and I do this myself, I think it's really easy to say like, well, I'm the librarian here and I think the best thing to do is X, Y, and Z. But that's the moment moment where you really need to be like, I'm the librarian here and it's my decision, but let me really make sure I've thought about all of the impacts of this. And then finally, think about the many ways that your community may already be providing this collections feedback to you, particularly if you work in a library where there's not a ton of crossover in staff, or just there's natural siloing, which happens a lot in libraries. How can you draw those connections across to all the other important things that we do? Collections are, I believe, in a biased way, the heart of any library service. But that doesn't mean they're better or worse than anything else. It just means that we need to be really intentional in how we connect all of these different things. Even if patrons don't think about it that way, all of these things can inform each other and help us have a better picture of what people are asking us for. So I'd be curious to hear in the chat if you want to. I personally find it great to like write down and commit to doing something in a webinar, because otherwise you're going to do what I do, which is leave this webinar and like go right into a meeting or go right on desk. You're all probably very busy people. So if you have 2 minutes, because we do still have time, you can write down in the chat or for yourself, like, what is the one thing from this slide that you want to try over the next month? There are 2 more of these, as Becca mentioned at the beginning. The next one will be about intellectual freedom. And then after that, we'll talk about finding balance in a collection. And they're all, you can come to 1 or 2 or 3 or however you want to do it, but they are all kind of integrated too. And particularly when we talk about intellectual freedom and balance, I think the reason I led with community-centered collection development is I think being community-centered in how you build your collections is a really important component of being able to protect intellectual freedom in your library. And I also think it's the data you get from community-centered practices and collections is what allows you to find good balance and maintain good balance in your collection. So if you're coming to all 3, I really encourage you to pick one of the takeaways to work on as we go through the 3 webinars, because we'll keep returning to a lot of these ideas as we go through and just look at them from different angles.